I spent 27 years as an Alaska State Trooper in the Fish and Wildlife Division before I retired to run a small crabbing operation inside a fisherman's cooperative in a place I'll call Grayling Cove, a southeast Alaska community built around a shared wharf and icehouse easement that's let our boats land and process crab together since 1958. Then a newcomer built a private dock extension across that wharf easement, using a survey his own engineer later admitted he'd altered, blocking half our fleet's access during the 3-day opener that decides most of our season's income. And when I asked our cooperative to enforce the easement protecting that wharf, I learned that the Dockmaster we'd trusted with our whole harvest reporting for 10 years had been quietly falsifying fish tickets and selling the difference to an outside buyer the entire time. By the time the state finished its investigation, the block dock was the smallest thing he'd been hiding. My name is Magnus Solvang. I'm 66, and I spent 27 years as an Alaska State Trooper in the Fish and Wildlife Division, most of it working commercial fishing enforcement out of a district office in southeast Alaska, before I retired 6 years ago to run a small crabbing boat and dock operation inside a cooperative called the Grayling Cove Fishermen's Cooperative. My marriage ended 11 years ago, well before I retired, and my daughter Freya lives up in Anchorage now, close enough that we still talk most weeks, but far enough that the cove can feel genuinely quiet in the off-season. Grayling Cove was organized in 1958 by a group of Dungeness crab fishermen who realized, the way a lot of small commercial fishing communities eventually do, that no single family could afford to build and maintain its own processing dock and icehouse, and that the whole community would be better served pooling their limited entry permits and infrastructure into one shared operation, rather than each boat trying to land and process its catch independently. The founding families recorded a wharf and icehouse easement across the cove's shoreline, granting every member boat the right to use a central dock and cold storage facility, along with a cooperative structure that pools and administers several members' state-issued limited entry commercial fishing permits for efficiency. I want to explain why that wharf easement and our permit pool matter as much as they do, because it's the whole reason this story unfolds the way it does. Alaska's limited entry permit system caps the number of vessels allowed to fish a given area, and a cooperative's harvest quota in practice depends heavily on the volume its member boats actually land and report each season, since state fisheries managers use reported landings to set future harvest limits and monitor the health of the fishery. Every one of our member families depends on the wharf staying fully accessible during the short, weather-dependent openers that make up most of a crab season, and every one of us depends on our landings being reported honestly, since a cooperative with a history of underreporting risks, having its future quota cut by regulators who have no way of knowing the reports were ever wrong in the first place. I've served on the cooperative's dock oversight committee for 4 of my 6 years here, a volunteer role that mostly involves reviewing new member dock access requests, coordinating the short, intense processing schedule during each opener, and occasionally walking a disputed shoreline boundary with a newcomer who isn't sure what the wharf easement actually covers. It's work that lets me use the same careful, patient attention to documentation and regulatory compliance that defined my whole enforcement career, just aimed at our own small cove instead of an entire fisheries district. Our cooperative has always relied on one hired professional to run the daily operations of the shared dock and icehouse, a dockmaster named Elias Thornbury, retained for 10 consecutive years to coordinate boat scheduling during openers, manage the icehouse and cold storage, and file the mandatory fish tickets recording every pound of crab our member boats landed each trip. Elias came recommended by a neighboring cooperative when the board first hired him, and over 10 years he built a reputation as the one person who understood every detail of running a small commercial dock well enough that the rest of the volunteer board, myself included, rarely questioned his day-to-day decisions in any real depth. My days these days run on the crab season's short, demanding calendar. Most of the year is quiet. Boat maintenance, gear repair, the slower work of the dock oversight committee. But each opener compresses a season's worth of income into a handful of frantic days, boats running gear around the clock, the dock and icehouse operating at capacity, every hour of access mattering in a way that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't fished commercially. It's a rhythm that took some real adjustment after 27 years of an enforcement officer's schedule, but it's become the thing I genuinely look forward to now, even on the hardest days. Grayling Cove has changed some since the founding families first organized it, the way any 65-year-old cooperative eventually does. A handful of founding families are still here, people who remember hand-hauling crab pots before the cooperative ever pooled its permits. But a growing share of newer members came into the cooperative by buying into an existing family's share, rather than any real involvement in the cooperative's governance. Members who understand Grayling Cove exists, but don't always understand why the wharf easement and the permit pool's reporting integrity matter as much as they do. I don't hold that against anyone. You don't need to understand limited entry permit administration to love fishing crab out of a beautiful cove, but it does mean fewer and fewer members each year could actually explain the cooperative's reporting obligations from memory, myself and a shrinking handful of others aside. My own boat and dock share run almost entirely on my own labor these days, with one deckhand I bring on for each opener, working a modest permit share within the cooperative's pooled allocation. I sell everything I land through the cooperative's shared processing and marketing arrangement, the kind of small operation that survives less on any single boat's volume than on the reputation the whole cooperative has built with regional processors over decades. I've spent enough gray mornings running gear in a hard chop, doing the same close mental accounting of catch per pot I used to do reading a boat's logbook for inconsistencies during an enforcement boarding, to understand exactly how much invisible discipline sits underneath something that looks, from a restaurant menu, like nothing more complicated than a crab dinner. I still remember, 6 years ago, sitting through my first dock oversight committee meeting and watching Elias walk the room through that season's landing totals and icehouse capacity, with the easy, practiced fluency of a man who'd clearly done this many times before, citing per-boat tallies and cold storage throughput with a confidence the rest of us simply took at face value. I remember thinking, at the time, how fortunate we were to have a dockmaster this competent handling something this operationally demanding. It didn't occur to me until years later to wonder whether that same fluency might, eventually, become exactly the kind of cover a real problem could hide behind. The property at the cove's northern edge, a modest cabin that had changed hands a few times over the years without much incident, sold 2 winters ago to a man named Garrison Kettner, a recreational boater from Juneau, who told the neighbors who welcomed him that he planned to build a small private dock for his own sport fishing boat, since he'd bought the place specifically for the water access he assumed came with waterfront property in a working harbor. I thought little of it that winter, since building a modest private dock on one's own waterfront is an entirely ordinary thing for a new owner to want, wharf easement or not. It wasn't until the season's first real opener arrived in early summer, boats lining up before dawn to make the most of a window that would close in 3 days no matter how much crab was still out there, that I understood what Garrison had actually built. His dock extension ran well beyond any reasonable private footprint, cutting directly across the recorded wharf easement corridor and forcing half our fleet into a single-file bottleneck that cost boats real time during the shortest, most valuable stretch of our entire season. I motored over to his dock that same morning, mostly out of the same instinct that had made me flag 100 boundary violations during my years on patrol before ever writing a citation. "I don't think we've properly met," I said. "I'm Magnus, from the Dock Oversight Committee. I have to ask about this extension. It cuts straight across our recorded wharf easement, and it's costing half the fleet real time during our opener." Garrison looked genuinely confused by the question, which I took, in that first conversation, as a reasonably good sign. "My surveyor mapped the whole shoreline before I ever built anything," he said. "The survey showed my private frontage extending well past where you're saying the easement runs. I paid good money for that survey specifically, so I wouldn't build anything I wasn't entitled to. There's a recorded specific easement corridor along this whole stretch of shoreline," I told him. "It's not usually something a private survey overrides without a formal review. Would you mind if I asked the committee to compare your survey against the recorded easement plat?" "Please do," Garrison said, with the confidence of a man who believed he'd done his homework and paid for exactly the verification he needed. "I've got the full survey report if you want to see it yourself. I wouldn't have built a single piling without being sure I was inside my own frontage." I want to explain why I didn't simply call the state's Tideland leasing office that same morning and let the matter resolve through ordinary shoreline development code alone, since a fellow boat owner or two suggested exactly that once word got around. The state's tideland permitting process governs new construction below the mean high tide line, but it has no independent mechanism for verifying which private survey is accurate when it conflicts with a decades-old recorded cooperative easement, a document that exists entirely outside the state's ordinary permitting review and depends entirely on our own cooperative actually enforcing it. A state permit confirming Garrison's construction met ordinary tideland development rules would have told me nothing at all about whether his survey had correctly located our recorded easement corridor. I pulled our own recorded easement from the district recorder's office that same week. Along with the original 1958 Grayling Cove Wharf survey the founding families had commissioned before ever organizing the cooperative, documents I'd reviewed more than once in my 4 years on the Dock Oversight Committee. The easement was exactly as specific as I remembered. A fixed corridor running the full length of the cove's working shoreline, with any new private construction along that stretch requiring a formal committee review that Garrison's project, as far as I could find in our own meeting minutes, had never actually received. I called our cooperative's small administrative office the next morning and asked to see the Dock Oversight Committee's file on Garrison's dock proposal. The part-time administrator who answered told me, after checking, that the approval had been handled entirely by Elias directly, based solely on Garrison's own survey, with no independent verification against the recorded easement plat, and no committee review documented anywhere in the file. I called Elias directly that same afternoon. "I understand you're upset about the bottleneck during the opener," he said, in the practiced, unhurried tone he'd used at committee meetings for as long as I'd known him. But Garrison brought me a professional survey showing his frontage clear of the easement corridor. I had no reason to second-guess a licensed surveyor's work. A licensed survey doesn't automatically override a recorded easement plat without at least comparing the two documents, I said. I'd like to understand why that comparison never happened, on a review you've handled correctly for 10 years. I took the survey at face value, Elias said. It looked professionally prepared, and I didn't think there was any reason to doubt it. I walked the full length of the disputed corridor the following week, with a surveyor of our own, mapping exactly how much dock access had been lost during the opener, and comparing Garrison's survey stamp against the recorded easement plat side by side. Our surveyor found the discrepancy almost immediately. Garrison's survey had been drawn using a boundary marker that didn't match any marker referenced in the original 1958 recorded plat, a discrepancy specific enough that no honest surveying error could easily explain it. I brought our surveyor's findings to Elias directly at our next scheduled dock oversight meeting, laying out the discrepancy against the recorded easement plat. "This isn't a case of two documents disagreeing by accident," I told him. "Somebody used the wrong marker deliberately, and it happens to be the one marker that makes Garrison's dock look like it's on his own private frontage." "I'm not a surveyor myself," Elias said. "I approved it in good faith, based on paperwork that looked legitimate to me." I retained a property rights attorney the following week, a sharp, patient specialist named Lucinda Prentice, who'd handled a handful of shoreline and tideland easement disputes for other Southeast Alaska cooperatives before ours. "This is about as clean a survey fraud case as I've reviewed," she told me during our first meeting, spreading both surveys and the recorded plat across her desk. "A deliberately mismatched boundary marker isn't an honest mistake. Somebody wanted this survey to show something the actual ground doesn't support." Lucinda retained an independent state-licensed surveyor to formally examine Garrison's original survey documents, and that surveyor's report confirmed our own findings. The marker used to establish Garrison's claimed private frontage had been altered from the surveyor's own field notes, which correctly showed the boundary running exactly where our recorded easement plat placed it. I brought the findings to Garrison directly, catching him at his dock one afternoon. "Our independent surveyor is telling us your survey doesn't match your own surveyor's actual field notes," I told him. "I don't think this is something either of us caused, and I want you to understand this isn't personal. I just need our wharf to keep working the way it's worked for over 60 years. Garrison's reaction was immediate and, as far as I could tell, entirely genuine. "I need to see this myself," he said, already reaching for his phone. Within a week, Garrison's own confrontation with the surveying firm produced an admission from the surveyor himself. He'd altered the boundary marker at Garrison's request, in exchange for a payment well above his ordinary survey fee, specifically to make Garrison's planned dock extension appear to fall within his own private frontage, rather than across the cooperative's easement. That admission, a licensed surveyor willing to falsify field notes for the right price, and a newcomer willing to pay for exactly that falsification, was the moment this stopped being a simple boundary dispute and became something considerably more serious. I called Odessa Kwan, a younger board member who'd reviewed dock access requests alongside Elias during a previous season, that same evening, mostly to ask whether she'd ever seen him accept a survey without independently checking it against the recorded plat before. Every other request I've seen him handle, he pulls the plat himself and compares it line by line, Odessa told me. This is the only one I can remember where he just took somebody's word for it. Her answer told me Elias's uncharacteristic carelessness on this one specific approval was itself worth understanding, even before anyone suspected there might be a financial motive behind it. I mentioned this to Ingmar Kroger, our cooperative's board president and a second-generation Grayling Cove family member, over coffee a few days later, mostly just to see whether he'd noticed anything unusual about Elias's handling of the approval. Now that you mention it, Garrison's approval went through unusually fast, he said, setting his cup down slowly. I remember thinking at the time, it was nice to see the process move quickly for once. I didn't think to wonder why. Lucinda laid out two paths that summer. The first was a straightforward easement enforcement action against Garrison and the surveying firm directly, seeking removal of the unauthorized dock extension and compensation for the fleet's lost harvest income during the bottlenecked opener. The second, slower path involved formally examining why Elias had approved a survey without his usual independent verification, since if Garrison's payment to the surveyor had also somehow reached Elias, that would raise a considerably more serious question about the Dockmaster's own conduct. I'd pursue the easement claim against Garrison and the surveying firm first, since that gets your wharf corridor cleared fastest, Lucinda told me. The Elias question is a longer process, but if there's any indication his uncharacteristic carelessness here wasn't really carelessness at all, that's worth surfacing more broadly, rather than just handling it as a private dispute between neighbors. We filed the easement enforcement action and a formal survey fraud complaint with the state licensing board that July, seeking removal of Garrison's dock extension and damages for the fleet's documented harvest losses during the blocked opener. Garrison, once he understood he'd been defrauded by his own surveyor rather than having done anything wrong himself, cooperated fully. He authorized removal of the extension immediately and pursued his own separate claim against the surveying firm for the cost of the fraudulent survey. Here's the micro setback. Removing the dock extension and restoring full wharf access couldn't happen until late summer, since specialized marine construction crews capable of safely removing pilings driven into tidal shoreline were booked solid through the remainder of the primary crab season, meaning our fleet operated at reduced dock capacity through at least one more significant opener before the corridor could be fully cleared. Lucinda negotiated an interim damages arrangement, covering the harvest losses from the blocked opener, but the physical bottleneck itself simply couldn't be resolved faster than a qualified marine crew's schedule allowed. That whole summer was harder on the cooperative than I let on to Ingmar during our regular check-ins, since a bottlenecked opener isn't something you can simply make up for later in the season when the whole business depends on those few days. Several of our smaller boat owners lost a meaningful share of their own annual income that season, all traceable, opener by opener, directly back to a dock extension that should never have been approved in the first place. The state licensing board hearing that October was brief, since the surveyor's own admission left little room for dispute, and the board revoked his survey license and ordered restitution covering the cost of the independent verification survey, while the civil case against Garrison and the surveying firm jointly resulted in full compensation for the fleet's documented harvest losses. Garrison, for his part, seemed almost relieved to be vindicated as a victim of the fraud rather than its author. "I want you to know, I never meant to take anything from anybody," Garrison told me at the dock not long after the hearing. "I paid a professional for an honest survey, and got a criminal instead. I'm the one who's out a dock extension and a fraud claim of my own, because I trusted the wrong person. I remember standing at that dock afterward longer than I needed to, thinking the whole dispute had resolved about as cleanly as a survey fraud case ever does. A clear violation, a surveyor who confessed once confronted, a licensing board that didn't need much convincing. It's strange now, looking back, how contained that afternoon felt at the time, given everything it turned out to be the opening chapter of. I assumed, walking away from that hearing, that this was substantially the end of it. I was wrong, and it was Lucinda's routine follow-up question about how Garrison's dock approval had originally made it through our process so quickly, which sent her digging into Elias's broader approval and fish ticket filing history, that showed me exactly how wrong. The records Lucinda pulled to answer that one narrow question about Garrison's approval speed opened into something much larger. Elias's fish ticket filings, compared against the ice house's own scale records going back nearly a decade, showed a consistent and troubling gap between the tonnage our member boats had actually delivered to the dock and the tonnage Elias had reported to the state on the mandatory landing tickets our cooperative's future harvest quota depended on. Lucinda pulled the cooperative's full scale and fish ticket records the same week, a routine step given how central Elias's personal control over the reporting process had turned out to be, and what she found reframed the entire situation. Nested among years of otherwise ordinary landing reports were a consistent pattern of fish tickets reporting tonnage, several percentage points below what the ice house's own certified scale had recorded for the same deliveries, a gap that, compounded across 10 years and dozens of openers, amounted to a substantial volume of crab that had never been officially reported to the state at all. Look at how consistently this gap tracks across nearly every opener for a decade, Lucinda told me, spreading years of scale printouts and filed fish tickets across her office table, obtained through the records request. The scale weighs every delivery automatically and prints a ticket right there at the dock. There's no innocent explanation for why the number that made it onto the official state filing is consistently lower than what the scale itself recorded. I pulled Pacific Rim Seafood Processors' own purchase records that same week, out of the same instinct that had once sent me tracking down an unreported harvest by cross-referencing a processor's buying records against a fishery's official landing totals during an enforcement investigation. Pacific Rim, a processor operating out of a neighboring community, confirmed that Elias had personally sold them crab on the side for years, tonnage that matched almost exactly the gap between our cooperative's certified scale weights and the tonnage he'd reported to the state. I motored over to Garrison's place that same week, mostly to let him know what Lucinda had found, since his own ordeal now looked like it had happened at the hands of a dockmaster who'd been comfortable cutting corners with far more than one survey. I had no idea any of this was going on, he told me. Elias just seemed like the guy who had the whole operation handled. I trusted him because everyone said he'd been running this dock successfully for a decade. That detail, a 10-year dockmaster's reputation for competence, apparently substituting, for years, for any actual outside verification of what he was reporting to the state about our own catch, turned out to matter more than either of us understood standing at his dock afternoon. Elias Thornberry had served as Grayling Cove's dockmaster for 10 consecutive years, a tenure built on a reputation, earned early and never seriously questioned since. As the one professional whose operational judgment about the dock and its reporting obligations, the rest of us simply didn't feel qualified to second guess. Nobody in a decade of seasonal committee meetings had ever needed to ask what happened when the dockmaster entrusted with protecting our cooperative's honest standing with state fisheries managers started quietly falsifying the very reports that standing depended on. I want to answer plainly why Elias believed he could run this pattern across 10 years without anyone noticing. The honest answer is that fish ticket reporting, for all its formal language in state fisheries regulations, ultimately depends on the person standing at the scale, reporting the weight honestly. And Grayling Cove, like a lot of small cooperatives that outsource this kind of specialized administrative work, had simply never had a reason to independently verify that reporting before a survey fraud investigation happened to open the door. Lucinda discovered, through the records request and Pacific Rim's own purchase records, that Elias's side sales totaled just over $200,000 across 10 years, Money that never once appeared in any cooperative financial statement any of us had reviewed and approved at a general meeting. I spent an evening that week going back through nearly a decade of my own Dock Oversight Committee notes, comparing them against the scale printouts and filed fish tickets. The same close, patient cross-referencing I used to do matching a vessel's logbook against its actual catch during an enforcement boarding. More than once, I found an opener where the scale printout showed one clear number, and the filed fish ticket showed something meaningfully lower. A discrepancy that, in my old enforcement career, would have been exactly the kind of pattern that triggered a formal fisheries violation investigation on its own. I called a former colleague from my Fish and Wildlife days, a retired Alaska Department of Fish and Game Enforcement supervisor named Bartholomew Nyquist, who now consults on fisheries compliance cases across the southeast panhandle, mostly to ask whether the kind of scheme Lucinda had found was something he'd ever encountered elsewhere. "I've seen individual boats shave a number here and there," he told me over the phone, "but I've never personally seen a Dockmaster run a coordinated underreporting scheme with an outside buyer for this long. It's a genuinely serious scheme, precisely because it exploits exactly the kind of trust the whole quota system depends on." Hearing that a pattern this specific still struck a career fisheries enforcement supervisor as unusual was, in its own way, more unsettling than if it had simply been common. I want to note here something that took me a while to fully process myself. Our own bylaws had always given any Dock Oversight Committee member the authority to request direct access to the ice house's raw scale data at any time, a right almost nobody on the committee had ever exercised in 4 years, myself included, simply because Elias's fish ticket summaries were fluent enough, on their face, that asking to see the raw scale printouts felt almost like an accusation, rather than routine diligence. I think about that reluctance more than almost anything else from this whole ordeal. How a genuinely reasonable norm, deferring to specialized operational expertise, can quietly curdle into exactly the blind spot somebody's counting on. The full picture. Once Lucinda retained an independent fisheries compliance auditor to reconcile 10 years of scale data against filed fish tickets, was considerably worse than a handful of shaved numbers. The auditor's report traced a consistent pattern. Nearly every major opener across a decade showed the same systematic gap, always in the same direction, always routed to the same outside buyer, in a volume that had quietly and cumulatively put our cooperative's future harvest quota at genuine risk, since state fisheries managers use exactly this kind of reported landing data to set the limits our whole community's livelihood depends on. This is the same shape as most of these schemes. Once you actually trace the scale data, instead of just reading the filed tickets, the fisheries compliance auditor told the board, laying 10 years of scale printouts next to filed fish tickets. A Dockmaster with sole control over both what the scale records and what gets filed with the state has no natural check on either function. It's the consistency across 10 straight years that makes the intent unmistakable. I want to be honest that I didn't fully appreciate, until the auditor walked the board through it, how much this scheme had actually put at risk beyond the diverted proceeds. Every one of our member families' futures depended on the state's confidence that our cooperative's reported landings honestly reflected our actual harvest, and a decade of systematic underreporting meant our entire quota allocation, the thing that determines how much crab every boat here is even allowed to catch each season, had been calculated on falsified numbers the whole time. I spent a weekend that fall sitting with the auditor's opener-by-opener comparison sheets, matching scale weights against filed tickets across 10 years. The same close, patient cross-referencing I used to do matching a suspect vessel's fuel receipts against its claimed fishing grounds during an investigation. The gap between the two sets of numbers, opener after opener, was not subtle once laid side by side. I didn't have the authority to confirm anything beyond the documented scale and ticket data, but the shape of the pattern was becoming impossible to explain as anything other than deliberate, sustained fraud. The fisheries compliance auditor pulled one more thread that reframed things again. Alaska's commercial fishing statutes themselves, which Lucinda obtained the full relevant text of, explicitly classify knowingly filing a false fish ticket as a distinct criminal offense, with penalties considerably more serious than an ordinary reporting error, since the law exists specifically to protect the integrity of a quota system Every commercial fisherman in the state depends on being administered honestly. I sat with the full audit report alone one evening before bringing it to the rest of the board, mostly because I wanted to be certain of what I was actually looking at before asking 4 other volunteers to trust my read on something this serious. 10 years, $200,000 in diverted proceeds, and our entire cooperative's future harvest quota, calculated on numbers that had been quietly false the whole time. My daughter Freya called that same night for our usual check-in and found me still at the kitchen table with the report spread out well past midnight, and she stayed on the phone quietly while I talked through it out loud, the same way I used to work through a difficult enforcement case with a colleague before committing to a final recommendation. I brought the audit report and Elias's fish ticket fraud scheme directly to our cooperative's 4 other board members at a specially called meeting, all of whom, to their credit, seemed genuinely stunned by the scale of what the documents showed. We trusted Elias specifically because he was the one person who actually understood the reporting requirements in real depth, Ingmar Kroger told me, visibly shaken. I signed off on his season summaries for years, without ever once asking to see the underlying scale printouts. I understand now why that was more convenient for somebody than I ever realized. I requested Elias's contract be terminated directly at that meeting, laying out the fish ticket fraud scheme in front of a room that included several of the cooperative's boat owners, whose own future harvest quota had, unbeknownst to them, been put at risk by a decade of falsified state filings. Every ticket I've ever filed reflected my honest professional judgment about the catch, Elias said, when the board invited him to respond. I don't believe there's any actual fraud here. Scale readings can vary, and dockside estimates aren't always precise. Your own scale printed one number, and the ticket you filed with the state consistently showed something lower, opener after opener, for 10 straight years, while you sold the difference to an outside buyer, Ingmar said. That's not imprecision. That's a scheme you built quietly inside a professional retainer the rest of us trusted you to fill honestly, at real risk to every family's future here. A third board member, Odessa Kwan, the young boat owner who'd worked closely with Elias's operation and had noticed his uncharacteristic carelessness on Garrison's survey, without ever fully naming what it might mean, asked the question that seemed to land hardest in that room. Elias, did you personally handle every one of these underreported tickets and every one of these side sales yourself? Or did anyone else at the dock ever know what the scale was actually showing? Elias's answer was a long pause followed by an admission that he had, in fact, personally handled every falsified ticket and every side sale himself across all 10 years, a detail that undercut whatever thin defense he might otherwise have offered about a dockhand acting without his knowledge. Lucinda laid out 3 paths forward, all running through channels considerably more serious than our earlier dispute with Garrison. First, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game itself needed formal notice of the falsified fish tickets, since the entire cooperative's quota allocation and every member's future harvest tied to it depended entirely on that agency's confidence in our reported landing history. Second, state law treats knowingly filing a false fish ticket as a distinct criminal offense, a remedy considerably more serious than an ordinary reporting dispute, since the requirement exists to protect a quota system. Every commercial fisherman in the state relies on being administered honestly. Third, the cooperative deserved a straightforward civil path to recover the proceeds Elias had personally diverted. I'd pursue all 3 simultaneously, Lucinda told the board. The Fish and Game notice protects the quota every member's livelihood actually depends on. The criminal referral treats this as the offense it actually is, rather than a mere reporting dispute. And the conversion suit gives the cooperative a clean path to recover whatever Elias personally diverted. We filed formal notice with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game that autumn, attaching the Fisheries Compliance Auditor's full report and 10 years of reconciled scale and ticket records. We filed the criminal referral the same week, and separately filed the civil conversion action seeking recovery of Elias's diverted proceeds. Here's the micro setback. The department's initial response placed Grayling Cove's harvest quota under a formal review, pending its own investigation into the true scale of the underreporting, a standard precaution that, while ultimately necessary, meant every member boat faced the possibility of a reduced quota allocation for the coming season, regardless of their own individual honesty, right as several of our smaller boat owners had no real financial cushion to absorb a reduced season. "This is the painful part of doing this the right way," Lucinda told me. "A quota review protects the fishery's own long-term health while the department investigates. It also means the cooperative absorbs real short-term uncertainty for a problem one person created." Ingmar raised a second concern at that same meeting that hadn't fully occurred to me until he said it aloud. "If Elias anticipates this investigation dragging on," he said, "there's nothing stopping him from seeking a similar Dockmaster position at another small cooperative in the meantime, given how convincingly he can talk about dock operations." Lucinda agreed the concern was legitimate and flagged it directly to the department's compliance office, which added a note to its own regional file, recommending any future cooperative verify a Dockmaster's scale reconciliation independently before relying on self-reported landing figures. That autumn stretched longer than I'd hoped, largely because both the department's quota review and the criminal referral moved at the deliberate pace these processes generally do, and more than one evening found me at my kitchen table with Lucinda's case binder, wondering whether our cooperative's quota might simply come back reduced before anyone finished sorting out what had actually happened. The turning point came when the department's own field auditors, conducting a full independent reconciliation of our cooperative's actual harvest capacity against verified scale data from the years before Elias's underreporting began, confirmed that Grayling Cove's underlying fishery and every honest boat owner's actual landing history remained genuinely sound once Elias's falsified tickets were properly isolated and corrected. The department restored our cooperative's full harvest quota within 9 weeks of that finding, once it became clear the underlying fishery remained genuinely healthy and the falsification was attributable to one individual's scheme rather than systemic dishonesty among the membership, reinstating our full allocation with a formal notation requiring an independent dockside monitor to verify scale weights against filed tickets for a probationary period going forward. Ingmar Kroger called a special meeting that winter to formally present the results of both the department's review and the criminal referral, a meeting that drew a larger turnout than any cooperative gathering I could remember in 4 years, including several boat owners who'd never before attended a general meeting, but who understand, now, exactly what a decade of unverified trust had put at risk for the whole cooperative's future. I spent the afternoon before that meeting walking the cleared wharf corridor alone, checking the restored dock access one more time out of the same old habit that had started this whole process months earlier, and found myself thinking less about Elias specifically than about how ordinary the whole slow drift into it must have felt from the inside. It's a strange thing, standing at a dock you've worked from for years, to realize the scale's own quiet, automatic printout had been telling a true story all along. It just took someone willing to actually read it, instead of trusting one man's filed summary of it. One of the cooperative's smaller boat owners, a widower named Casper Lindgren, who fished a modest permit share on his own small boat, stood during public comment and said something that landed harder in that room than almost anything Lucinda or I had said all autumn. "I trusted that our reported landings were protecting the quota my grandchildren might someday fish under," he said. "I want to know how close we actually came to losing that future, without any of us ever understanding why." Garrison, whose own survey fraud ordeal felt almost distant by comparison now, spoke next, addressing the room rather than the board directly. "I trusted a surveyor and a dockmaster to both tell me the truth, and neither one did," he said. "Once I understood what Elias had actually been doing to the whole cooperative's future, I didn't feel like that was something worth just letting go, because untangling it was inconvenient." The board voted unanimously that evening to formally terminate Elias's contract and to adopt the department's required independent dockside monitoring process permanently, and Odessa Kwan, who'd stayed largely quiet through most of the meeting after her one-pointed question weeks earlier, spoke again near the end, addressing the newer members directly. "Some of you weren't here when this cooperative pooled its permits back in 1958, she said. "I've spent several seasons learning this operation from the ground up. We took our reporting obligations seriously because the founders understood what it meant to protect a fishery for the families who'd come after them, and because it actually mattered to what this place became. I'd hate for anybody fishing out of this cove now to think that mattered less than it used to, just because somebody found a way to profit off cutting the corner. The state prosecutor, concluding the criminal investigation that spring, charged Elias with fish ticket fraud under Alaska's commercial fishing statutes, and the civil case that followed resulted in a conversion judgment covering the full value of the proceeds he'd personally diverted. Casper Lindgren's own small permit share, once the cooperative's full quota was restored and the required independent monitoring process was in place, fished its first full season under the new system that following year, without incident, a relief he made a point of sharing at the next general meeting. Elias pleaded guilty to the state charge that summer rather than face a full trial on the complete scope of the case, accepting a sentence that included the conversion judgment, a term of probation, and a permanent revocation of his ability to hold any commercial dockmaster or fish buyer position, requiring state reporting authorization again. The restitution order, once finalized, required Elias to repay the diverted proceeds on a structured schedule, with a portion of each payment directed specifically toward funding an independent dockside monitoring pilot program the department now offers to small fishing cooperatives. Something Lucinda told me was an unusually thoughtful addition to a restitution order of this kind. Most restitution just goes back to the cooperative, and nobody outside your community ever hears about it again, she said. Getting a piece of it earmarked toward actually helping the next small cooperative verify its own Dockmaster's numbers is the kind of outcome that might genuinely help another community avoid exactly this situation. Odessa Kwan volunteered to serve as the Dock Oversight Committee's liaison to the new independent monitoring process, given her own hands-on experience with the daily operation, and Casper, once his own permit's future was fully secured, became one of the most engaged new volunteers our committee had seen in years. I called Bartholomew Nyquist, my own former Fish and Wildlife colleague, back once the restitution order was finalized, mostly because I felt he deserved to know that the scheme he'd found so unusual over the phone had turned out to match our situation almost exactly. I wish I could say I was surprised, he told me, but I'm glad you had the reconciliation to actually prove it this time, instead of just a general sense that some of these cooperatives are left with. I've thought about that phone call more than once since. How a scheme brazen enough to genuinely surprise a career fisheries enforcement supervisor had still managed to run undetected in our own cooperative for a full decade before a survey fraud investigation happened to open the door to it. People sometimes ask whether one newcomer's block dock was really connected to a $200,000 fish ticket fraud scheme or whether I simply got lucky pulling at a loose thread. I don't think it was luck, and I don't think the two things were ever as separate as they first looked. Both depended on the same quiet bet, that a small cooperative of Alaska crab families, having found one professional fluent enough to trust completely, would never think to check whether that fluency was still being applied honestly. The question underneath all of it was never really about one blocked opener. It was about whether Grayling Cove could trust that the reporting protecting our whole cooperative's future harvest quota and every family's livelihood tied to it was actually being handled the way it was supposed to be, or whether that protection would get quietly hollowed out, one falsified ticket at a time, by whoever figured out how convenient nobody else's scrutiny had become. My daughter Freya asked me, on one of her visits down from Anchorage not long after the settlement, whether I regretted spending the better part of a year on a fight that started with a single newcomer's dock extension, instead of just accepting the interim damages and letting the rest go. I told her the honest truth, no. Though I hadn't expected, at 66, to spend most of a year reading state fisheries statutes and fraud audit reports, instead of just running my boat and working the openers the way I always have, every season since I retired. She told me that sounded exactly like the kind of thing I'd spent 27 years training for without ever expecting to actually need it again, which is about as fair an assessment as anyone's offered me since. I think about Elias more than I expected to, honestly, in the months since this resolved. 10 years is a long time to hold a cooperative's trust honestly, before a pattern like this takes hold. I don't think he set out, in year one, planning anything like what it eventually became. I suspect the first shaved ticket, for a single tight season, felt like an ordinary shortcut he intended to correct later, and each subsequent one simply got easier to justify than admitting the first one had ever happened. I don't offer that as an excuse. I offer it because it's a more useful lesson than simply calling him greedy and moving on. Since the version of this story where somebody sets out from day one to jeopardize an entire fishery's future is rarer than the version where somebody drifts into it one convenient shortcut at a time. Garrison's stretch of shoreline is clear and full width again, for the first time since his dock went in, and I've taken to running my boat past that corridor most mornings during an opener, the same way I always did before any of this happened, just to confirm it for myself. Garrison stops by the dock most weeks now, mostly to compare notes on his own ongoing claim against the surveying firm, and I don't hold any of this against him. He was as much a victim of that fraud as our fleet was of Elias's. Casper Lindgren joined the Dock Oversight Committee with me this year, the first new volunteer we've had in nearly 5 years, and he's brought a genuinely useful patience to explaining our reporting obligations to newer members that I'd been handling almost entirely on enforcement instinct alone for years. Ingmar Kroger pushed through a permanent bylaw amendment requiring the department's independent monitoring process our own quota had always technically allowed for, finally adopted, plus a mandatory second signature from a board member on any season's final ticket summary, regardless of how trusted any single Dockmaster becomes. Odessa Kwan has taken to giving informal talks at our general meetings a couple of times a year now, walking newer members through the actual mechanics behind our wharf easement and our quota reporting the way the founders understood them. Since she says, half the disputes a cooperative like ours ever runs into start with somebody simply not understanding why a rule exists in the first place. I sat in on the first one myself, notebook in hand out of old habit, and found myself just as absorbed as any of the newcomers, hearing her explain a system I'd reviewed cold for years, but had never once heard laid out in quite that plain, patient way. The new independent monitoring process the department now requires has kept every scale reading and every filed ticket open to any cooperative member who asks. A policy so simple, I sometimes wonder why it took a scheme this size to make it standard practice here. I've stopped by our new monitor's records more than once now, not because I doubt anything, but because I've found I like the reassurance of checking now and then, the same way I used to review a closed enforcement case once more after an investigation wrapped, just to be sure. I think, too, about how differently this could have gone if Garrison had simply been a dishonest man building where he had no right to build, rather than a genuine victim of a fraudulent survey, and none of us had ever thought to ask why an experienced dockmaster would skip his own usual verification on this one particular approval. It's a lesson I've carried back into how I run my own operation now. I keep my own copy of every scale printout, for every delivery I make, not because I distrust the new monitoring system, but because I understand now, in a way I didn't fully appreciate before this happened, how easily even an honest system can quietly stop checking its own work once everyone gets comfortable enough to stop asking. Freya has started asking, on her visits down from Anchorage, whether I'd consider stepping back from the Dock Oversight Committee one of these years and letting somebody else carry the seasonal workload. For most of my 6 years here, I assumed I'd keep at it until I genuinely couldn't run gear anymore. Now I think differently about it, not because the work's grown harder, but because I understand, in a way I didn't before Elias, how much a cooperative benefits from more than one member actually knowing how to read a reporting system's real integrity. I've started mentoring Odessa specifically with that in mind, walking her through the full 10 years of reconciled scale and ticket records, the way a fish and wildlife colleague once walked me through my first major fisheries fraud case, so that whenever I do eventually step back, this cooperative won't be relying on any single person's word again, the way it quietly did for a full decade, without ever quite meaning to. I got a call last month from a board member at a small fishing cooperative further up the coast, a woman named Fenella Drummond, who'd read about our case in a regional fisheries newsletter, and wanted to know how we'd gone about proving the scale reconciliation held up under real scrutiny. I spent the better part of an hour on the phone with her, walking through the same opener-by-opener cross-check I'd run almost by instinct the week I first started digging into why Garrison's approval had moved so unusually fast. It struck me, hanging up that call, that this was probably closer to the actual point of all of it than any restitution figure or criminal conviction. One more small cooperative, somewhere else on this coast, now knowing exactly what to check, and exactly how to ask for it, before their own trusted Dockmaster's convenience, quietly became something else entirely. I didn't do any of this out of anger at Garrison, or even really at Elias, though I won't pretend the scale of what he was willing to risk over 10 years of small, compounding shortcuts doesn't still trouble me when I think about it. I did it because that wharf was built in 1958 by families who understood this cove couldn't survive without an honest accounting of what came off the water, and because Ingmar and Odessa and Casper and a room full of neighbors were willing, once somebody showed them what was actually happening, to stand up and say it mattered. Turns out that's most of what keeping a cooperative's promise intact actually requires. Somebody willing to keep reading the actual scale, and enough neighbors willing, when it matters, to show up and ask why the numbers don't add up. This video is a dramatized storytelling narrative based on real-life themes and commercial fishing, cooperative, and fisheries regulations. Names, characters, and specific locations are fictional or have been changed for privacy. Visuals are generated using AI tools for illustrative purposes only. This content is for entertainment purposes and does not constitute legal advice. If your cooperative's most trusted professional has been handling something highly specialized without much outside verification for years, would you know how to check whether that expertise is still being applied honestly?